Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Israel Dialogues. I'm Rabbi Zachary Goodman. Good to be with you again. I don't want to take any time. We have a wonderful panel planned for us today, and as always, I want to introduce David DeWitt to set the frame for us before we meet our panelists. Today, we're going to be talking about the UN. I believe we entitled this "Israel and the UN: A Troubled Partnership." So a good conversation for us today. As always, if you have questions or comments that you'd like to pose to the panels, please do so through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens, not the chat box, but rather the Q&A function. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we have time for. With that, thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you to our panelists. And David, thank you for setting the frame for us.
Thanks, Rabbi. Thanks very much. Welcome, everyone. The session today is special in many ways. As I was thinking about what I would say at the outset, I reflected on the many times I was in front of a large introductory class of international relations students at the university. And being in Canada in particular, one of the early topics would always be international institutions, multilateralism, the place of Canada in international affairs, what difference we make, all that cluster. And within that cluster, there was always the issue of the United Nations. And inevitably, a student would say wonderful things about the United Nations in terms of its aspirations. And then the comment would be, but look at all it hasn't done. And then someone else would raise their hand and start criticizing the United Nations. And then, of course, the response is, well, if we didn't have the UN for all its flaws, we'd have to reinvent it. Because as the world has shrunk in one way, by our ability to communicate, and the forces of globalization, it has also expanded in terms of moving from 45 states that were recognized at the founding of the UN to the 193 we have now. So suddenly the UN is, as it in many ways has been for a very long time, the premier organization that is the parliament of the world, if one wants to think about it. But then it has this sidebar, which turns out to be one of the principal actors within the UN, and that's the Security Council and the P5. And for those of you who've been following this, you know, as we've seen in the tragedies that's been unfolding the last 2 weeks with the Ukraine and the Russians, the P5 that is empowered to push forward international peace and security and well-being has too often been stymied in trying to carry out those responsibilities because of the veto that's enshrined within the UN Security Council. And so we have these internal competing forces. The last comment I would make before turning over to my colleague, John Allen, who will moderate this session and introduce our guests, is that in the Middle East, we can see many extraordinarily positive things that the international institutions of the world, through the UN, have carried forth. Beginning, of course, in the early days of the post-World War II period, and the assistance given to the emerging states in the Middle East, not just Israel, but we all recognize that so many of the countries in the Middle East were born through the periods of imperialism and colonialism. Western powers drew boundaries, and the UN came in as a way to try and, in the post-World War era, before the Cold War, try to stabilize, consolidate, create opportunity, and that included dealing with the Israel-Palestine, though at that time it was really very much Israel interstate with the Arab states. And we have a history now of Israel, the Arab world, and Iran, and Israel and the Palestinian people, all voicing their interests and concerns through the UN system. None of them, I think, being terribly satisfied. With that, let me turn it over to John Allen to moderate the session and thank our guests for joining us.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Rabbi. Just before I introduce my two former colleagues, Masoud Hussein and John McNee, let me just add to your introduction, David. There's a famous quote about the UN. I actually sent it to Bob Rae when he was appointed, and it goes something like this: blaming the UN for the failure to prevent violence and human rights abuses is like blaming Madison Square Garden when the Knicks lose a basketball game. The UN is, it's an institution, it's a building, but it's made up of its member states. And when you want to criticize the UN, you know, you really got to criticize states around the world. Don't always look to the institution. And I think the other thing that I'm sure Masoud and John will talk about is the UN is not just the General Assembly, and it's not just the Security Council. It's multiple agencies that are doing incredible work every day around the world, including in the current crisis. So let me just introduce my former colleagues at what was, when John McNee and I joined, called the Department of External Affairs. And then it was called, I think, Masoud, when you joined, it was probably the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade. And now, of course, it's called Global Affairs Canada, GAC for short. Masoud Hussein is a lawyer and an expert on the Middle East. He recently retired from Canada's diplomatic service, having served in a number of senior positions in the department. He was ambassador to the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, and special envoy to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. He was the Director General of the Middle East Bureau, where he had to agonize over UN resolutions, Canadian policy, briefing ministers, et cetera, et cetera. And he was also, equally importantly, the Deputy Legal Advisor at Global Affairs Canada, because so many of the issues in the Middle East pass through the Legal Bureau for advice before the political bureau and then the politicians have to make their decisions. John McNee also retired, served in Tel Aviv from 1986 to 1989 as first secretary, a junior dip. Undoubtedly, that was an interesting time in Israel because there's never not an interesting time in Israel. He was subsequently ambassador to Syria with concurrent accreditation to Lebanon, where he was ambassador, and subsequently he was ambassador to Belgium. From 2006 to 2011, John was our ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations in New York. I should say one of the most prestigious positions in the Foreign Service, and one that is often, but not always, given to political appointees. Alan Rock, Stephen Lewis, Gerard Pelletier, Monsieur Blanchard, who was recently the ambassador before Bob Rae was appointed. In Ottawa, John served in various capacities. He was also the Director General for the Middle East and North Africa, and then he became the Assistant Deputy Minister, the most senior position responsible for Africa and the Middle East. And then when he retired, he became the first Secretary General of the Global Center for Pluralism in Ottawa. If any of you have been to Ottawa, it's a magnificent building situated neatly between the Embassy of Saudi Arabia and the Department of External Affairs. So I'm going to turn the floor over to John, and then Masood. John is going to do a little bit of a UN 101 for us to situate the conversation. And Masood is going to delve into the practical realities of dealing with people who on the one side think we're too soft on Israel and who on the other side think we're way too hard on Israel. So gentlemen, let me turn the floor over to you. John McNee, thank you so much for being with us and jumping into the lion's den on this.
Well, John, thank you very much. And my thanks to Rabbi Goodman and to Holy Blossom, to Professor DeWitt, and to the other conveners of the Israel Dialogues. I've had the great pleasure of watching a couple of them, and I've been very impressed by their thoughtfulness in considering some of the big issues. So congratulations. As John said, much of my foreign service career was devoted to the Middle East, including, and it really began with 3 wonderful years posted to Israel. The first one before the Intifada broke out, and 2 during the first Intifada. I think that the region somehow, gets into your blood. It's extraordinarily compelling, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity with you to look back at my experience. But a big disclaimer at the outset. I mean, you've had some really world-class experts come and speak at the Israel Dialogues. I don't pretend to expertise anymore. I've been working in other fields for more than 10 years, as John said, since I left the UN. And at the UN, this was really only a slice of what we dealt with. So therefore, I'm triply delighted that my friend Masood Hussain is with us. Masood, as John said, he's former ambassador to the UAE, and he is an expert on both the UN and the Middle East. And I had the great pleasure of serving with him at our mission to the UN in New York. He'll speak more in depth on the substantive issues and Canada's role. And it's also a pleasure to be with John Allen, who, as you know, is one of our most thoughtful ambassadors and did a terrific job as ambassador to Israel. I'd also like to signal, I know this came up in Dr. Khawadi's introduction, with Professor DeWitt's blessing, I thought I would also briefly look at the UN and the invasion of Ukraine, because this is the issue which is on all of our minds today. I have 3 pretty simple theses. The first is that rather than looking at Israel and the UN, I suggest we sharpen the focus and look at Israel in relation to the Security Council, Israel in relation to the General Assembly, Israel and the Secretary General, and Israel and the funds and programs and specialized agencies. I think that works better. That said, my second point is that the General Assembly of the United Nations, with its universal membership, as David DeWitt suggested, 193 countries, comes as close as you can get to representing the international community. So when it takes a view on an issue, that's the view of the international community. And third, regarding the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Security Council in history has only really proven itself to be effective in maintaining international peace and security, which are its core responsibilities, when there has been some substantial measure of agreement among the permanent 5 members. The authorization of the Gulf War Coalition is probably the high water mark in my book, and the inability to do anything confronted with the Syrian civil war and now Ukraine, its nadir. So the UN. There isn't really one UN. It's a very complex organization. And John, at the risk of tremendous oversimplification, I would say there are 4 main UNs. The first, the Security Council, responsible for maintaining international peace and security under the UN Charter. And its decisions are binding and have the force of law. The General Assembly, which, as I think David said, is really the parliament, but it's a parliament with 193 political parties. The Secretary General and the Secretariat, the 7,000 international servants who serve him and really serve the member states, devoted to peacekeeping operations, humanitarian affairs, political questions, economic and social issues, the environment, legal, fisheries, you name it. And finally, the funds and the programs and the specialized agencies, from the International Civil Aviation Organization in Montreal to the International Atomic Energy Agency to UNRWA. So to consider briefly the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the UN. All four of these UNs are highly engaged. Let's start with the High Commissioner for Refugees and UNICEF and the World Food Program. They are in the lead in coordinating the international response to a staggering refugee and humanitarian crisis. The Secretary General, you can be sure he is talking on the phone to Putin and Lavrov, to Macron and to Biden, to Zelensky and to the Germans, and trying to help them find some way out of the crisis. The third, the Security Council. So we all know that Russia vetoed a resolution proposed by Albania and the United States condemning the invasion and calling for the withdrawal of Russian forces. The vote was 11 members of the council in favor, 1 against the Russians, and 3 abstentions, China, India, and the United Arab Emirates. So how did this come to pass? And I'm thinking of Professor DeWitt's first year class in international relations. I think we need to go all the way back to the creation of the UN, to the wartime alliance that defeated fascism. The idea was that the permanent 5 members of the organization, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China, would be the global policemen, and together they would work to prevent another world war. But as we know, the record has been decidedly mixed. Let's take the last 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, as the Security Council has dealt with numerous issues in the Middle East. I mentioned before the authorization of the Gulf War Coalition to expel Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. And later the Council permitted the NATO bombing campaign against Gaddafi in Libya. But a deeply divided Council did not endorse, nor could it prevent, the US-led invasion of Iraq, nor was the Council able to find a way to put an end to the agony of Syria's civil war due to Russian intransigence supported by China. Today, tragically, we're seeing a similar pattern. Now, this is not how the UN was supposed to work. The permanent 5 were supposed to uphold, not violate, multilateralism, international law, and the global order. Now, I commend to you a powerful speech by the Kenyan ambassador to the UN, Martin Kimani, in one of the Security Council debates. He condemned the invasion as a violation of Ukrainian sovereignty, but his even deeper argument was that after independence, the new African states could have sought to redraw their borders to achieve, in his words, greater ethnic, racial, or religious homogeneity. But if they had, we would have been waging bloody wars for decades, end of quote. He rejected looking back into history with a dangerous nostalgia, which I think is exactly what Putin is doing in part. This, I think, is the reason why so many developing countries voted for the subsequent resolution of the special session of the General Assembly. 141 voted to condemn Russia. There were over 190 co-sponsors of that resolution. I think it's fair to say that was a big diplomatic victory. Now, you might well ask, well, why weren't there even more? And I think you have to look, only 4 other countries joined Russia in voting no. What you really, I think, have to look at is why did so many countries, a significant minority, abstained or simply didn't vote? And the answer really probably lies with their bilateral interests with Russia, starting with China and India, and a significant number of African countries who chose not to support the resolution. But as Bob Rae argued, what the vote did was it isolated Russia. It made it very clear that this is not a conflict between Russia and the West. This is Russia and the world. But still, a General Assembly resolution does not stop the war. You may have seen a very interesting commentary in the Globe last Saturday by Professor Jennifer Welsh of McGill, who argues that the General Assembly could have gone farther. It could have called for broader international participation in sanctions. It could have authorized a commission of inquiry regarding potential atrocity crimes. But that's still possible, and I think we should watch this space to see what happens at the General Assembly. So to turn to Israel and the UN. The Security Council is obviously an extremely important part of this picture for Israel. Security Council resolutions set the framework and establish the principles for Arab-Israeli peacemaking. And the Middle East and North Africa have had and continue to have a large place on the Security Council agenda. And all the regional issues that come before the Council, even the ones that aren't specifically about Israel, they all matter to Israel. Going back to the Gulf War, the UN sanctions on Saddam, Iran's nuclear program, the situation in Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Yemen to this day. So all these issues are important to Israel. I won't dwell here too long because, especially since the United States from the aftermath of the 1973 war in particular, has taken for itself the role as protector and defender of Israel before the Council, I thought I might turn to the General Assembly resolutions, which may be a little more perplexing. Now, thinking of those resolutions, I would be the first to acknowledge that the resolutions criticize Israel in part, and that come forward year after year may seem repetitive and even ritualistic. As John Allen said, these resolutions were, I confess, the bane of my existence when I was responsible for the region in the department. In large part because we didn't draft them. They weren't how Canada would have put it. And we had to weigh, but were they close enough to our policy to be acceptable? Should we support? Should we explain our vote? Should we abstain? Should we explain our vote? What were our allies doing? This was not easy for us. But I'd just like to make 3 short observations about the resolutions. The first, and Masood will explain this better, but these resolutions do speak to real, unresolved issues that all have the potential to affect peace and security in the region. The right of Palestinian self-determination, a 2-state solution, the status of Jerusalem, the Israeli occupation of the Syrian Golan, as some of the examples. So that's one thing. Second, what is the Palestinian and the Arab group strategy with these resolutions? Well, clearly the Palestinians are the weaker party, and weaker still since the demise of the Oslo Accords, weaker vis-a-vis Israel, and lower as a priority for the Arab states. At the same time, the United States protects Israel and the Security Council. It's only in the General Assembly can the Arab side muster a strong majority in support of their position. So let's put ourselves in their shoes. What would we do? This is the one forum where they have the advantage. And my third observation is, well, why do they have the advantage? And why do the General Assembly resolutions attract such wide support? I think it's really quite simple. The majority of the member states of the General Assembly are developing countries which won their independence from colonial powers in the 60s and 70s. They see the Israeli-Palestinian question through the lens of their own national liberation movements and struggles. And that results in an instinctive identification with the Palestinian national cause. And support for Israel from the West, by the United States, by Canada and others, only reinforces their perception that this is a neo-colonial situation. So I'd like to now turn it over to Masoud. And one thing I didn't touch on, but we could explore, is what approach is the most effective one for Israel to take vis-a-vis the UN. But with that, John, I'd like to pass the floor to my friend Masoud.
Thank you so much, John. I found that a real learning experience myself, despite the fact that I spent a bit of time in the legal bureau and actually was at the UN for a brief time. So that was very helpful and sets the context now for Masoud. Thanks so much, Masoud. The floor is yours.
Thank you, John. And again, thank you everybody for having us today. This is a real pleasure to have this opportunity to share views. Like John McNee, I think all of us who were DG Middle East at Foreign Affairs bear the scars of having to deal with these wretched resolutions over the years, and how do we deal with them? And it's never easy. Despite that they don't have any mandatory force, certainly delegations and governments, including our own, spend an incredible amount of time going through these and figuring out how to deal with them. At the UN, so I'm going to focus mostly on the General Assembly, and I wanted to address this question. Do these resolutions demonstrate that there is an anti-Israel bias within the UN? I think that was sort of the general question, and that is a general perception. There's certainly a compelling narrative for this. 300 to 350 resolutions each year at the General Assembly. 15 to 22 of those resolutions are going to be directed at Israel in one form or the other. And the narrative goes, no other country faces this many resolutions in the General Assembly. And this is a demonstration of a clear bias of the Assembly against Israel, of the UN against Israel. It's setting up structures that no other country has to face. And I have to say, this is a compelling argument. There is much to it, but it's not the only narrative. And there is another narrative that comes out of these resolutions, which John touched upon, which I'll get to towards the end. And both sides have their arguments of bias and unfairness, which you can choose your poison. And for me, I think, and I'll end with this, so I'm just giving you my outline. I'll end with this. I think it really comes back to a very fundamental and unresolved clash between what is and should be the role of the international community in the Middle East peace process and the Arab-Israeli, Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So let me just go a little bit about the GA in case people don't know too much about the General Assembly. As I said, it does about 300 to 350 resolutions a year. So I mean, it's quite a crazy schedule. But a lot of those resolutions are just rollovers. You get a resolution passed, and then each year it continues to get passed. You need to have at least one sponsoring state, and then you get a bunch of member state. And then you get a bunch of sponsors, and the more sponsoring countries you can get, the better, the stronger the resolution gets. Your goal is to get consensus. You want to show that all the member states of the General Assembly of the UN agree that this is an issue and agree with this resolution. And there are a number of resolutions that go by consensus or without vote. Sometimes these sorts of resolutions, a country might disassociate itself from a paragraph, or might decide to disassociate itself from the resolution, but not block the general consensus. And we get a number of those things. The General Assembly divides itself up for its work in looking at resolutions into 6 committees. So the first committee is on disarmament. The second committee is on economic and social affairs. The third committee is on human rights. The fourth committee is on decolonization and special political missions, which includes peacekeeping. This is where a lot of the Arab-Israeli issues come up. The fifth committee is the budget committee for the UN, and the sixth committee is legal affairs. You can also get a resolution going directly to plenary. So it doesn't go through a committee first for negotiation, it goes directly into the plenary. And there are a number of resolutions that deal with the Arab-Israeli conflict that go directly to plenary. When you sort of look at these different resolutions, they do different things. So I think it's useful also to understand what are the different types of resolutions and why they may exist. As you might imagine, resolutions that are coming out of the fifth committee, out of the budgetary committee, have spending commitment to it. And this is extremely important because this is how the UN members allocate the budget and decide on which items are going to be financed and to what extent. So, you get budgetary type resolutions. You can get administrative type resolutions. Some of these resolutions will create structures within the UN. So you might set up a committee. It might set up direct the Secretary General to set up a division. It might direct the UN Secretariat to do specific reporting on an issue. And then others of these resolutions, I would say, are more declaratory. They're trying to say, this is an issue, it's an important, this is how it should be solved. And again, this is where you're going to get a bunch of states voting yes or no. As you sort of look at, if you look at the narrative, and this is sort of what Canada has done, there's too many of these resolutions, therefore this sheer volume demonstrates bias. Therefore, we're not going to look at substance, we're going to vote no. Because it's there's 16 to 22, this is too much, it's biased. And therefore we're going to do a process no, as opposed to looking at a case by case, do we agree with this resolution or not? But as you sort of start looking at some of the resolutions, you see some of the problems with this approach. And you can ask whether Israel is unfairly singled out in some of these issues as being Israel, as opposed to for other things. I'll give you a very good example. In the first committee on disarmament, there's two resolutions. One is on creating a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East, and the second one is on having a disarmament conference for the Middle East. Both of those are sponsored by Egypt. Now, is Israel singled out in these? Yes, it is. It's singled out because it's the only state in the region that's not a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it's the only state that is widely believed to actually possess nuclear weapons. So Israel gets the benefits of suspected nuclear deterrence. There's a price to pay for that. And the price to pay for that is you are going to get singled out when they're going to be talking about disarmament and non-proliferation in the Middle East. Is that an unfair bias? Well, again, this is the cost of having those. You get a couple of resolutions that are not Palestinian. So you get two resolutions from Syria on the Syrian Golan. One comes out of the fourth committee, one comes out of the plenary. And again, these are broadly reactive to purported annexation, either de facto or de jure, of the Golan Heights. So this is Syria. It was in peace negotiations. Those have broken down, and it's using the GA. There is one resolution by Lebanon, and coming out of the second committee, which is about oil spills. So they basically want compensation for a massive oil spill in 2006 that they claim was done by the Israeli Defense Force, Israeli Air Force, and they're asking for almost $1 billion. So that's that resolution. It doesn't go to the core of the Middle East peace process. There are a couple of resolutions actually in fifth committee about financing. So you get some financing issues on UNIFIL, which is the Lebanon peacekeeping mission, and on UNDOF, which is the Golan Heights peacekeeping mission. Now again, one assumes actually Israel prefers having these buffer zone UN peacekeeping observers rather than not. So again, these are not specific to Israel. It's about setting up a structure. Then you get about 4 resolutions, which are far more administrative. One is about setting up the Committee on the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinians. and this is a member state committee. The other is setting up a special committee on Israeli human rights practices in the occupied territories. Again, a member state, because I think there's 3 member states on that. One is about a special division for Palestinians in the UN Secretariat. And the 4th one is about a special information program for Palestinians within the Secretariat. So again, these are far more sort of creating structures. Israel doesn't like them. Israel complains that these committees, they're biased, and they're spending member state money on promoting Palestinian views within the UN Secretariat. But that's what these resolutions do. So already, you know, we've already looked at, out of 15 to 22, you've already got about half of them are not sort of doing anything about the core. They're really doing other things. And sometimes, again, in Israel's favor, if one assumes that the UNIFIL, the peacekeeping missions are good for Israel too. Then you get another 3 or 4 resolutions that are really about aid to the Palestinians. And these ones are extremely important to the Palestinians. One is aid to the Palestinian people. And you might say, well, and the other one is aid to Palestinian refugees. And you might say, well, why aren't these just one resolution? But the decision to keep them separate partly comes out of their genesis. The aid to Palestinian people is really about supporting the Palestinian Authority. It's about helping, getting donors to contribute through the ad hoc liaison mechanism to really support Abbas and the PA. Aid to Palestinian refugees is really about encouraging donors to give money to UNRWA. And the other one, piece of that is the operations of UNRWA, which again, UN agency, special relief and works dedicated to the Palestinians. When you remove those, you end up then really into the 5 or 6 resolutions that go to the core of the issue. The right to self-determination, which again comes out of actually 3rd committee, the Human Rights Committee, gets very broad support, and Canada shifted its vote to yes last year. Palestinians, refugees and their properties. This is one that's important for the Palestinians because it goes to the issue of access, equitable access to water in the occupied territories. The right of the right of Palestinians in the occupied territories over resources goes to water and agriculture. Right of refugees to their property goes back to a bit of the right of return and compensation, Resolution 194. And one is there's a resolution on Jerusalem. And a number of resolutions go to Israel's responsibility as an occupying power, as viewed from the Arab side. So applicability of the Geneva Conventions, illegality of Israeli settlements in the occupied territories, and those practices. So you know, what's interesting about, so when you sort of chop them up like that, you end up seeing that there's a much smaller core of resolutions that actually try to address the actual fundamentals of the conflict. Another important thing about these resolutions, a number of them create reporting obligations. They create structures and reporting obligations. And John McNee and I know this firsthand, the problem of information. This is a key problem for all of us, not just at home, but in the UN. Whose information do you use? There's an allegation that an orchard has been raised by Israeli settlers. It's an allegation. Who knows? Who has the facts? How did it happen? Was it an accidental fire? Was it an intentional act? These are the problems in terms of how do you get credible information upon which you can make decisions. And this is where the UN both succeeds and fails. This is why we set up special rapporteur structures within the UN who are supposed to be independent experts who can, in principle, supposed to travel to the place and try to help get to some of the facts over the allegations. But it doesn't work usually very well. And again, we have a special rapporteur for Iran, never allowed to visit Iran. Group of eminent experts for Yemen, never get to go to Yemen. The problem is, how do you then end up having credible information that you can use? As John said, so those are the resolutions writ large, and I'll go to sort of what's the game. For obviously for the Palestinians, they're playing both a short and a long game. The short game is going to be when there's a new event, they want this reflected somehow. They want the international community to have a chance to express itself. And they'll do this in two ways. One, they may update a new resolution. They may update an existing resolution, but they don't often like to do that. The proliferation of resolutions isn't just because they want to have more and more resolutions. Part of the reason it's actually, if you've already got strong support for a resolution, the more you add to it, the more you risk actually affecting that support. So it's somewhat easier at times to do a new resolution as opposed to trying to tinker too much with an existing one and hence making the negotiations for that existing one more complicated. And I think a good example of that is the Syrian Golan. There's two resolutions, one that comes out of fourth and one that comes out of plenary. The one in fourth committee gets like 140 some odd votes in favor. The one that comes out of plenary gets 90. So there's much less support for that second resolution than there is for the first. I don't understand personally the Syrian tactics in not having just one resolution, but they, for whatever reason, they decided they wanted to have two resolutions. But it could very well be that they prefer to try to keep the 149 pristine, keep that support by not adding stuff. And that also can be the case with the Palestinians. There's also a long game. And as the two sides get into negotiations, for the Palestinians, they want to try to show that the majority of states view the conflict from this lens. So for example, and again, for the lawyers amongst us, the difference between disputed and occupied is not just semantic. It can be legal, right? Very few states say, I am going to flagrantly violate international law. They usually try to say either that's not what the law says, or the facts of what I'm doing are not part of this. So again, in the Israeli case, they're going to say, these are not occupied territories. Of course, Geneva Conventions apply to occupied territories. These aren't occupied territories, they're disputed territories. And therefore, this legal regime doesn't apply here. And the Palestinians will say, no, these are occupied territories, and hence the Geneva Conventions apply, and hence you as the occupying power has certain responsibilities that you have to undertake. And so that's part of the long game, is trying to demonstrate, whether it's in negotiations or in something else, that this is the view of the broad majority of the international community. For me, and this is, I'll end up here and go for my bit. For me, there's really a fundamental clash between the Israelis and the Palestinians about what the role of the international community, and particularly the UN, should be. For Israel, the UN, really, the goal was always direct negotiation between the parties. They did not want to internationalize or multilateralize. And Madrid was set up on the notion that there would be direct negotiations between the two parties. For the Palestinians, as the much weaker side, they much prefer to have multilateral. They want to try to bring all this support to bear in the direct negotiations in one form or the other. And again, the Madrid process demonstrated this clash. On the one hand, direct bilateral negotiations on certain issues. On other issues of a more regional nature, you were going to end up having a multilateral process, including on refugees, which Canada ended up chairing. So this fundamental clash, I think, is sort of what gives you the two perspectives and narratives of the UN. If your view of the UN is it has basically no role except to, say great when you get to a peace deal, you are not going to want to, you are going to view all of these resolutions as broadly trying to interfere in this and being unhelpful. And that's the Israeli narrative. If you are the Palestinian side and you view that this is actually an international conflict and the international community has a role and the UN should be deeply involved in this, then you're going to look at these resolutions as a demonstration of the will of the international community. And that's why these competing narratives, to say this is a demonstration of bias and unfairness by having the resolutions, that goes to the one narrative. But there is the other narrative that no, this is an international responsibility and interest. Jerusalem is an international interest. Refugees in the host countries are an international interest. The last thing I'm going to say, John, and before I pass it back to you, is just both sides also claim bias and unfairness, right? So for the Israeli side, they're going to say, like, look, all these resolutions, nobody else has to put up with this. Look how bad some of the human rights practices are in other places, and they don't have this. On the Arab side, it tends to be more an argument of two weights, two measures. Hang on, you have, from our view, occupied territories, and you're doing things, and you get GA resolutions. Saddam invades Kuwait, and he gets sanctions, and he gets military action. So you will often hear on the Arab side, two weights, two measures. Your violations of international law, get you non-binding finger wagging. Our violations of international law get us sanctions and military action. And so one sits in the GA, one sits in the Security Council, and that, again, this is the sort of the competing narratives of bias and unfairness. Why don't I end it there? Because I'm sure there'd be a lot of questions.
Thank you so much, Masood, and thank you again, John. Lots of material. I'm sure we've got lots of questions. I haven't checked the Q&A box. I have a few questions of my own. Panelists, please come on board. And let me start off with a couple, if I can. Let me start off with a difficult one. And I know that you may or may not have been dealing with these issues at the time, but when one looks back at the UN to the Durban Conference, when there was a resolution which essentially said Zionism was racism, what impact do you think that had at the UN? Now, I should say that that resolution was subsequently reversed, but at the time, the conference, the resolution, and the views of so many member states were so controversial and were viewed by Israel and by the Jewish community as being blatantly anti-Semitic and certainly anti-Israel. What do you have any views on that, and whether or not that has tainted people's views of the United Nations, et cetera? Thank you. And whoever wants to grab it, you're muted, John McNee. So why don't you go first? And
Sure. No, John, with pleasure. And because I was around at the time, and I remember it. I remember it vividly. I do think it was a terrible stain on the United Nations, collectivity. And Canada worked hard in Durban to try and avoid that result, and it was something of enormous concern to the Canadian government under Mr. Chrétien. John Manley was our minister at the time, and I remember being with Mr. Manley, and then he was on the phone to Mr. Chrétien. How were we going to react? What we were going to do? I think it reverberated for years, to be honest. And it put in question just this fundamental question of whether or not there was a deep bias in the system. And the part of the trouble is it was reversed and rescinded later, but that's not what sticks in people's mind. Huh? I'd even forgotten. When we chatted a while ago, I said, well, wasn't it rescinded? Oh yeah, but when and how and what did that mean and how did that come about? So I think the short answer is I think it was a very sad development that had continuing reverberations.
It's interesting. I remember in our conversation, we recalled that there was this great debate about whether Canada should join the United States and a couple of other countries and walk out of the conference. And I think it was the Prime Minister at the time that said, no, we should stay. We have to speak up in favor of Israel. We've got to try and negotiate this resolution out. So you had two different views, and I don't know whether the government was criticized at the time for staying. I think some people thought they should have just walked out. But anyways, that was very much a Jean Chrétien view of Canada's role in the world, I think. Masoud, do you want to just add anything on that?
I think, you know, again, so much of this is context and historic perspective too. You know, in the 1980s, Israel didn't recognize the PLO and wouldn't speak with the PLO, and the PLO didn't recognize Israel and wasn't speaking. They were both sort of in their zero-sum games. And it really took a while. It was 88 when the PLO started to move, and they started having the, we will accept Israel, we will recognize Israel, we're not going to ask for the destruction of Israel, and which also started causing some splits within the Palestinian ranks. But there was actually a GA resolution that Zionism is racism. That got repealed in '91 under George Bush Sr. It was part of the deal to get Madrid. I think that was for Yitzhak Samir. It was, you know, this has to go. If you really want to have peace, then this which goes to the, you know, to the sort of the crux of Israeli identity has to be removed, and it was repealed. The Arab states all voted against the repeal. I think it was like 25 countries that voted no on that, but it passed, and that resolution was repealed, and Madrid went forward. So again, there's a historical context to some of this stuff, which is quite interesting. If I can just give an anecdote, John, because I was at as a junior officer dealing with the refugee working group, and so I was lucky to be at the first refugee working groups here in Ottawa, and then the fourth one in Tunisia. So the first two refugee working groups. The Israelis and Palestinians, the Israelis refused to come into the room to sit with the Palestinians because the head of the Palestinian delegation was from the Palestinian National Congress. So it wasn't even, you know, directly PLO, but, you know, the Israelis and the PLO had not yet sort of formalized a relationship and a willingness to have direct negotiations. After Oslo, we had the Refugee 4 in Tunisia. And after, you know, when we were in the room in Tunisia, and the Israelis and the Palestinians came walking in arm in arm. Mm-hmm. And it was an amazing turnaround from the time when they couldn't even get into the room together, and we had to negotiate getting into a room, to walking in arm and sitting down and let's talk. Mm-hmm. So, you know, the historical context and how things shifted in that period, and then what was possible and what we were able to get rid of, some of these terrible resolutions actually get rid of, was fantastic.
And just following up on that, just to mention for those in the audience that, you know, don't recall or don't know, Canada was chosen to chair this refugee working group, which was considered, and we were chosen by the Americans, who were kind of running the post-Madrid operation, because we were deemed to be a country that could be balanced in a conversation about refugees. One of the most controversial issues, right of return versus compensation versus et cetera. And Canada led that group for quite a long time, even when the whole Madrid process had failed. Eventually we didn't. Let me turn to another question. Masoud, you dropped a little comment there about Canada at a certain point, basically saying all of these resolutions represent a bias against Israel, and we're not even going to look at them one by one. I think what you forgot to mention was that was the Harper government, which took a decision when it came in to basically say, this is ridiculous, there's too many, it does reflect a bias. In contrast, you both talked about John Manley and various other liberal foreign ministers and governments, which went through every one of these resolutions word by word, and, you know, were criticized by both sides inevitably for their positions. So do you want to just briefly comment on that? And then I see there's other questions from our expert panelists. So please go ahead.
Sure. I mean, and again, there was a tendency of movement in this direction, but again, not by lots of countries, but a number of countries started to shift. There was a consequence to this, right? Once we basically say we're going to do a block no, we were no longer part of the negotiating table on the resolutions. So again, typically the resolutions are negotiated in New York. The EU leads. And they work with the Palestinians, and they try to moderate language, get balance into these, and to a shape in which the EU is prepared to support. I did share that one the transcript, the summary of the transcript of the last time on the vote. What I found interesting in that was the UK, where the UK had shifted its vote on Jerusalem from yes to abstention because they didn't use both Haram al-Sharif / Temple Mount, but they only said Haram al-Sharif. They said, no, this is unbalanced. You have to say both. So, the language of these things are extremely important. And again, we basically took ourselves out of the game. We were nobody was going to ask our opinion because they knew we were going to vote no, because we weren't voting on the substance. We were now voting on the process. And so that's the consequences, that we're no longer at the table to say, you need to add this or subtract that.
Thanks very much. Dylan, can I turn to you first, and then I'm going to turn to Mark for questions from our expert panelists. You didn't get a chance to meet Dylan. He's just come on. He knows more about the intricacies of the Middle East. He's now works for the U10, the major universities doing their government relations, but he previously worked with CIJA. He's taken multiple missions, and he knows the intricacies of this dynamic better than I do. I'll tell you that. Dylan, please.
Thanks. So my question centers around what you were just discussing in terms of Canada's record of voting against the package of resolutions critical of, as you articulated, sort of the core of the conflict. I guess one question that actually comes from John's comment about Prime Minister Harper being the one that changed the voting pattern. My understanding was that it was actually Paul Martin in about 2004 who changed the voting pattern. At least I've heard him brag about it in a number of forums, although Harper obviously had a very strong line in support of Israel. My question has to do with, number one, you talked about it a bit, but how is Canada's role in voting generally against the slate of resolutions? How do you think it affects Canada in the world in general? You talked about the actual impact in terms of negotiating other UN resolutions, but the other question I have is specific to the resolution on Palestinian self-determination that the current Prime Minister changed Canada's vote on. That was a big political deal inside Canada's Jewish community. The assumption is that was done in an attempt to support Canada's effort to get a seat at the Security Council. Obviously, people don't know, unless they were sitting around the table, exactly what the motivation was there. But how strange is it for a country to change from a no to a yes on something like that, rather than moving to abstain first? And also wondering if you have other thoughts about the movement on that specific resolution and what it signifies in terms of Canadian foreign policy.
John, I'll defer to you first.
Okay, Masood and Dylan, these are very good questions. I think you're right. I think Prime Minister Martin, my recollection is that he thought that Canada should move, and 3 resolutions, I can't identify them, but he thought that we should move. To be honest, among this group, I think that he very much had in mind the domestic consequences of these votes. It was a different approach, Prime Minister Harper, and I think a much more, John Allen knows this better than anyone, a much more sophisticated view than is generally thought. I think the the sort of received wisdom is that Prime Minister Harper and his government were pro-Israel, skeptical of the UN, and very skeptical of these resolutions, and that Canada should simply vote for Israel. My sense, looking back, is that it is much more that Prime Minister Harper First off, Prime Minister Harper knew and knows the score about Israel and Palestine, and has no illusions about settlement policy and some directions in which Israel is heading, but he didn't think it was incumbent on a good friend of Israel's, like Canada, to take a contrary view, and that Israel had few friends in the world, and Canada was one of them and should support Israel in a way, come what may. I'll come to the impact on Canada's role because it recalls to mind one of Masood's and my least successful initiatives at the UN when Canada was a candidate for membership in the Security Council in 2010. I think it was just a week or so before the vote, we went before the Arab group of ambassadors to plead our case. After having lobbied them individually, repeatedly over a number of years, we knew them well, we understood their concerns, and they received us very warmly, but with great skepticism, because these resolutions, it's as if they had a big chart on the wall, Dylan, and they looked at them and they said, basically they said to us, come on, you vote that way in the General Assembly, what are you going to do on the Security Council when our issues come up? We can't count on you. Canada does a lot of good in the region. It has a strong track record. It wasn't for the war in Iraq, and on and on and on. But these resolutions, well, let me put it this way. They didn't help. They really didn't help. So there you are. The self-determination question, I would, why we changed, I mean, I think it's, if your policy is one supporting a two-state solution, but you oppose the Palestinian right of self-determination, I think there's enormous cognitive dissonance there. The two, one follows from the other. I see this as correcting what I would see as a mistake by the Harper government in not endorsing the Palestinian right to self-determination. So I don't think there were low motives there. I think it was coming back to a principled position. That's how I would see it. So, Masood, over to you.
Well, I'll just add a couple of things, just in terms of some of the impact. You know, again, John and I were there during this very strange time, and so we went to this block no, but you know, what we ended up doing went far beyond that. So I'll just give you an example. As the Palestinians got non-member observer state status, so you know they got the state terminology, it opened up doors for them, as we know. It allowed them to sign on to treaties. But it also would mean that where you had international conferences that had what was called in the UN system an all-state participation rights, and this would allow small countries or small, not quite independent countries to participate fully. So, for example, Cook Islands, which is normally sort of under the cover of either New Zealand or Australia for foreign affairs. But there's some conferences where they want all state because they, on climate change, for example, where they want to sit in their own right and participate fully as full members, as full participating states. So Canada, US, and a few others, we ended up having opposing this sort of formula because we didn't want the Palestinians to be able to use this now to come and sit as a full state in these conferences. So it ended up having some quite negative consequences for us because, you know, we've got nothing against the Cook Islands. We're very happy for the Cook Islands to come and sit at a climate change meeting and participate as a full participant. But because of the terminology and the use that, you know, the perceived use that the Palestinians could make of it, we ended up having to oppose these sorts of mechanisms and say, no, it's either UN member states or it's participants, and then NGOs and others, you know, all sit in sort of at the same status as states. So it would, you know, these are some of the unintended consequences that, to be quite frank, pissed off quite a few people because we were hurting Cook Islands or the Naurus of this world because we were trying to prevent something else.
Thanks. Let me turn to Mark Anshin, and then I'll turn to David DeWitt. And I see we also have a question in the Q&A box, but gentlemen, please. Thanks, Mark. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Masood. I've never had the privilege to meet you. and the same with John McNee. I just want to give a perspective of my own from having served at the UN on the Canadian delegation back in the mid-70s. And in those years, we actually had a seventh committee, Masood. We had the Special Political Committee. And it was through that committee that I served on that committee. I was the junior rep on that committee for Canada. And it was on that committee through which most of these resolutions that you discussed were going through that committee through to the General Assembly. And the thing that struck me was that each year the resolutions were essentially the same. And at the Special Political Committee, where the debates took place on each resolution, the same representatives made the same speeches each time. And when we had to send our reports back to Ottawa at the end of the day, it was very easy to do because we knew what they were going to say, and we were able to record it fairly quickly. One of the things that struck me, and even before I got to the UN, before I joined the Foreign Service, I did my graduate work with John Holmes, who was one of the early representatives for Canada to the founding of the UN and the starting of the UN. And I worked and helped him with the research on international organizations and the structure of the UN. And we talked about this whole situation of how the UN General Assembly during the 3 to 4 month session in the fall uses its resources and time. And so one of the perspectives I want to put out to both of you and try to see what you think is the General Assembly spends a lot of time and a lot of resources in debates that occur every year with a lot of repetition and not a lot of deliverables. In other words, not a lot happens as a result of those debates. Not a lot happens as a result of passing those resolutions, and there's a tremendous amount of resources being spent on translations and and recordings and production of documents and the minutes of the meetings and so on. And one of the concerns that Canada's always had is how the UN is funded, how it's resourced, and how its resources are used and applied. And it strikes me that here's a situation or an example where Canada could come forward and say, you know, during the General Assembly, the ongoing repetition each year on whatever the issue is, but today we're talking about the Middle East and Israel, is not a good use of our resources and time. We have precious resources here at the UN. There are very few countries who are members of the UN that fully meet their obligations every year in terms of resource, their dues and so on. And maybe Canada, as a committed member of the UN, could take a position and say, you know what, let's try to rethink how we're doing all of this every year at the General Assembly. And maybe we shouldn't be going through this process every year of continuing to repeat the passage of resolutions which really have no immediate impact on this particular conflict and on other conflicts, and really think about how to use that 3 to 4 month period on issues and subjects that are really where we really can make a difference.
So if I can just say something quickly on that. I mean, there's the famous what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And what we tend to our own view at the UN was we play both offense and defense. There's things we're trying to advance, and there's things we're trying to think that are bad ideas that we try to stop. But of course, not everybody shares our view of what's a good idea and what's a bad idea. So the argument that you just made, I could very easily see Iran stand up and say, like, for the last 15 years, Canada has been running this human rights resolution in New York. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of resources. Just stop it. Stop it. You know, you're only getting 88 votes in favor anyway. Why don't you make this every 2 years or every 4 years and stop wasting everybody's time? So, for us, this is an extremely important resolution, and we invest enormous amount of resources to bring it forward. Iran would love an argument that says, this is a waste of time, let's stop it. So, there's a give and take on all of this. The other thing I would just point out is the Palestinians have apparently been willing to look at biennializing some resolutions so that they're not coming back every year, but they come back once every 2 years. And there's been an attempt in the UN to do that with different resolutions to try to streamline some things. But it really depends on the sponsoring states. If you've got 140 countries voting in favor of something, what incentive have they got just because a country that's voting no anyway says we shouldn't be doing this? You're not doing it anyway. You leave the room and vote no, and we don't care.
John McNeil.
It's not quite to the point I was trying to make, but I think.
Well, Mark, I think it's an interesting point. I mean, I was new to the UN when I went there as ambassador. And after a few months, I was struck by the great conservatism of this institution, the General Assembly, and other, other parts are extremely dynamic and forward-thinking and creative, and some are very, very conservative, if not hidebound. And there have been efforts kind of with the same inspiration as inspiring you to renew the General Assembly. But that has proven quixotic in the extreme, and my heart went out to, we work very closely, as you recall, with Australia and New Zealand as a kind of an informal team, and the New Zealand ambassador co-led a group when we were there, renewal of the General Assembly. And the whole question of the resolutions came up, and couldn't they be streamlined or bunched or whatever. And I mean, this was water, crashing against the rocks. And so that isn't to say the effort isn't worthwhile, but I think it's, and some yards were made with these approaches, but I think it has proven difficult.
Can I just say the irony is that the resolution on revitalizing the General Assembly is one of those annual resolutions that are pretty useless.
The other, obviously, in some ways, more serious point is that when you take a look at the makeup of the Permanent Five on the UN Security Council, there have been efforts for decades to say, wait a minute, what are France and the UK doing there? Shouldn't it be the EU? Shouldn't it be Germany in lieu? Where is Brazil? Where is India? Where is Mexico? I mean, why do these countries who in 1945, rewrote the map of the world, why are they still there? And who's going to take the lead on that? Is the UK going to give up its seat? I don't think so. So unfortunately, we're a little bit bound. Let me turn the floor back over to David DeWitt for your question. Please, David.
Thanks, John. And thanks, Masood and John, for fascinating presentation and interesting discussion. Before I ask my question, a quick comment on this last topic. Back in the middle and late 1980s, I was part of an international academic team that was tasked for looking at the reform of the UN. And there were two things that stand out, other than the impossibility of getting agreement, was that, of course, the reform of the Security Council and the issue of, does that mean taking people off, countries off, or adding some new ones who also have veto? So they're permanent, like Japan pushed this very, very hard. And there was an argument about, well, Japan becomes permanent, but without the veto. The other thing, which was more troubling, was that all the research that was done came to one common conclusion, that the core of the problem was financial. That finances so constrained and affected the administrative operation and the structures of the UN that they didn't know which door to open first if you were really going to make change. And it never went very far. I'm sure there have been studies since then. Back to my question. I'm going to lift it directly, John, from one of the comments you made towards the very end of your presentation. What approach might be most effective for Israel within the UN? I really like to hear you both on that, and others who may want to pursue it on our panel, because it seems to me we've agreed that the UN is, as best as we can say it, here to stay in some form. It struggles with reform. It is not the institution it was when it was founded. It's not the institution it was at the end of the Cold War. The redistribution of goods and services globally is profoundly changed, though the allocation of contributions to the UN has not necessarily kept up with that. And Israel and the Palestinians, well, let me back off for a minute and say, first it was Israel and the Arab states. Now, there are things between Israel and Arab states that are exciting, may provide terrific opportunities. They're occurring outside the UN system. It's back to the focus on Israel and Palestine. So what approach might be most effective? Let me start with asking it in terms of Israel as a fully recognized member state, where the Palestinians have a different recognition. So from an Israeli perspective, if you really wanted to pursue peace and security as you understand it, how best to use the UN system to your advantage?
Maybe I could start, Masood, and then see what you think. And that's I think it's an important question. I mean, when I was in Israel, Tom Friedman was the New York Times correspondent in Jerusalem, and I remember he wrote, he said, Israel's a country, not a problem. Yeah. Or not a dispute, and that stuck with me. And I think in that vein, and as you say, as a full member of the United Nations organization, it should act like any other country. By that I mean, first off, defend its corner. I mean, defend it vigorously, and it has every right to do so and should do so on any of these resolutions. Present its case, but I didn't find that the approach taken under Prime Minister Netanyahu was really the most effective, which is to say, basically, the UN is biased against us. We'll never get a fair hearing. So, and especially when he would come and make a present, he would use the platform to criticize Iran or whatever and pick up his marbles and go home. I think Israel should engage as a full member of the organization and not just on questions of related either to the Middle East or to the Holocaust. I remember when in our time, Israel worked hard, and I confess I don't know where it went, on working with other countries on a resolution that was to go to the ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Affairs Committee, having to do with dry land farming. Now, here is an area of tremendous Israeli expertise, a huge challenge globally, an opportunity for Israel to work with a mixture of countries that they might or might not have had much to do with before. And it wasn't all about Israel or about the dispute. And I found that one of the most encouraging kinds of things. But like any country, you have to invest your resources, which are limited if you're the Israeli delegation, but to find things in which Israel has a contribution to make, so isn't isn't necessarily on the defensive. So that would be what I would suggest as an approach. Yeah.
I think the idea of going back to the old neo-functionalism. You identify your areas of expertise.
Yeah.
Use those as a way of building bridges.
Yeah, and it's expertise and credibility. I mean, it's a bit in. I'm thinking of the Mashav and the Israeli international cooperation, and which has achieved great things. So there's a basis there, and again, what's the expression in French? Les absents ont toujours tort. I mean, if you don't participate, it's never going to be to your benefit. So and there are lots of ways in which Israel can make a contribution to the broader UN agenda.
May I just jump in and say that Israel is doing a lot of that. Drip irrigation, which they developed and they're the experts on, is finding, they're selling drip irrigation all over the world to a plethora of countries, just as one example. So,
Masood, you wanted to just jump in there for how can Israel better play at the UN?
Right.
I would just say, I think there has been a big shift. I think there's a much less sort of anti-Israel bias within the UN. Israel is able to do a lot more. And again, the Holocaust denial resolution that got passed was a very good example. And again, looking at what the Egyptian delegate said, only the Iranians sort of withdrew from consensus but didn't block, which is a bit nuts. It was not surprising, but there's a lot more, I think, countries wanting to work with Israel. The African group overall has shifted quite a bit in terms of how it interacts with Israel. So there has been a lot of change. I think the fundamentals, again, from my analysis, will be though, if you're saying we don't want to deal with the peace process within the UN because it needs to be direct negotiations, insofar as there's nothing happening in direct negotiations, and insofar as, I think particularly under the Netanyahu government, a lot of countries are pointing the finger at you saying, well, the issue is you don't seem to really want to have negotiations and you're not open to a Palestinian state, then you've left a void that's going to get filled somewhere. So I think the best thing for Israel will be if there is direct negotiations and the peace process moving again, it takes a lot of this pressure out of the UN system because there's now something that's moving forward. But I think there's a lot of openness to Israel, much more than there was maybe 10, 15 years ago.
Okay, we've got a question from the audience. Arnold Englander asked, can Masood speak about, he says, a human rights commission? It's maybe a committee, perhaps, or a commission that was set up recently at the UN to deal specifically with Israel and to report annually. And he's asking, bearing in mind, as we all know, that the members of the Human Rights Committee in Geneva include such wonderful human rights advocates as Syria and perhaps Myanmar and maybe even North Korea. I'm not exactly sure about that, but I know that one or two of them have been on the committee, etc. So this is it's a specific question, but it's also a more general question. How does the UN get away with allowing the Syrias and the Myanmars of the world to pronounce on Israel or other countries for that matter?
Well, I guess there's a couple of things. One is, the Human Rights Council gets a lot of grief. The whole human rights process that's been set up in Geneva is largely about trying to get buy-in. So you get the bad guys on the committees and agreeing to universal peer review, which means it means their human rights record are going to be looked at and criticized and with the idea that this is supposed to be helpful, but it means ours will be too. It's universal, it's peer review, it's not singling out states. There is a general view in New York that human rights are dealt with in Geneva and they should stay in Geneva. So there are a number of country-specific resolutions on human rights in the GA in New York: Iran, Syria, Myanmar, North Korea. Israel has its own this committee that got set up, which has a similar sort of reporting function. So the starting point is we actually ourselves are in favor of country-specific human rights resolutions, and we lead on one. So we can't say as a matter of principle, which a lot of countries do. As a matter of principle, they vote against these things in New York because they should only be in Geneva. We don't take that position. We think New York also has a say on human rights issues. The problem is then some other countries then say, okay, fine, but then your friend's record should also be up for scrutiny, and particularly given the importance of factual information. Again, we need special rapporteurs. We need people to develop the factual information that should, create in principle, the common facts on which we're going to work. Doesn't work like that in principle, but that's the general idea. So it's hard to criticize, having these things set up because you've got universal peer review. You want these guys to have skin in the game and not reject the processes, and you want them to actually to be called to account somewhere. If you say you can't be on the council, they say, well, we're not going to play.
Mm-hmm.
And so they never, they never are called to the carpet to actually defend themselves. And I'll say one last thing on this, John. The single strongest weapon within the UN system is name and shame.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody wants to be singled out. Nobody wants to say, we're going to look at your human rights record and we're going to criticize it and for this. So that is actually, however weak it sounds, it's actually a really important aspect of accountability within the UN system.
Okay. I see we got about 5 minutes. I'm going to ask one last question. I don't see any other in the chat or in the Q&A or from my colleagues. John, you slipped in a comment about the fact that we've got the GA, but at the UN Security Council, the United States is essentially Israel's protector. We haven't seen a significant resolution out of the Security Council against Israel for some time. Despite all the criticism of Barack Obama's view of Israel, there was a minor change there. But taking the other, or taking a part of that question, the world says to the Palestinians and to Hamas and to the PA, you've got to reject violence, you've got to come to the peace table, and the Palestinians say, okay, we are going to try and use existing international institutions to try and get our views before the world. They do so relatively successfully in the GA. When it comes to going to the International Criminal Court, when it comes to going to the United Nations Security Council, though, it seems that the United States and some other countries do not want to go down that route. Have you got a view about that? Are they taking a substantive view of these issues, or are they, as you said, Israel's protector when it comes to these more high-level issues at the UN, or more enforcement related issues at the UN?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, John. I think that now the UN Security Council does meet and discuss situations that arise in the Middle East, and it is very responsive to what's going on the ground. And on those occasions, the Palestinians and Canada and the other member states have the occasion to express their views, and we always express a view. So it's not that they don't get an airing, but you're right when you come to, what's the upshot, what's the action, and I think Masood brought out that fundamental tension between solutions, should they come from a multilateral framework, under a UN chapeau of some sort, or direct negotiations, and which way do you lean? And then, the Americans have kind of taken both views at different periods of time. But I do think you're onto something, and it also points up the fact that that these questions can be put in a kind of in a legal frame, but they're intensely political. I mean, it would be much simpler if it was a legal matter and you could go to the to the Hague and get a decision. It's not like that. So they're infused with politics and political calculation. So I think you're on to something with that question. Yeah.
Somebody's got a dog in the background.
I'm afraid it's me.
Okay, you can mute yourself now. We couldn't mute you when you were answering, but thanks, John. Masood, do you want to take a crack at that, and then we'll. You got a minute or so. Go ahead.
I mean, I think ultimately the sense that this can only be resolved through direct negotiations in which both sides see enough that they're able to sell to their respective populations to get a lasting deal. So it's not going to be imposed from the outside. It's not going to be imposed by the Security Council, and it's not going to be imposed by the ICC. These attempts will be doomed to failure. And this is the problem, in the absence of any real negotiations, bilateral negotiations, you leave a void in which the Palestinians I think, desperately are trying to get themselves back into the conversation. Because again, and this is my general approach on this, since the assassination of Rabin, the peace process shifted from a bilateral negotiation between Palestinians and Israelis to an internal debate amongst Israelis as to what is Israel and Palestine going to look like? What are we prepared to give and not give? And since then, it's been, even the Gaza withdrawal was not a negotiated withdrawal. Ariel Sharon made that unilateral decision to leave. The Palestinians attempt to get themselves back into the game through these things, but at the end of the day, there will be no compulsion. At the end of the day, there will have to be, if there's to be a solution, it's going to be that both sides can take something back to their people.
Well, I think that's a wonderful way to end, because we can only hope and pray that both sides at some point in time will have the leadership that agrees that this is the way to resolve this, and that the UN and these, as you say, it's not going to happen there. It's going to happen across the table, and with the help of others, hopefully Canada and other countries. So let me just, on my behalf, on behalf of the panel, I'll let David conclude, our chairman. But thank you so much for taking the time. It was fascinating. It was illuminating. It was important. I hope our audience got something out of it. I know that we on the panel did, and we really appreciate your efforts. Rabbi, I guess maybe David is saying pass, so I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Sure. I only came back because I saw the wave off. No. So David, as always, thank you for your leadership with our team, and Masoud and John, thank you so much for joining us. Really learned a lot, as I always do at the Israel Dialogues, but this was a particularly interesting conversation. So I appreciate your time. I appreciate everyone who's joining us live, everyone who's watching this a little bit later, and maybe a little untraditional for the Israel Dialogues. I also want to wish all who are celebrating Purim next week a happy Purim. If you are looking for a place to hear the Megillah and a little fun spiel, I hope you'll check out Holy Blossom's website. We've got a link. You can join us in person or join us from your screens at home. So thank you everyone for joining. The gentleman on screen, thank you for your expertise. And until next time, we'll talk to you next week. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Rabbi. Shabbat Shalom.
Thanks, everyone. John and Masoud in particular, thank you.